Hi everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Naveen, the host of Sounds On and Off. We are a podcast that is dedicated towards showcasing different perspectives around deaf culture, hearing health, decision making, and many more. In each episode, we will bring on various guests that will share their unique stories and the path that they're on today in hopes that you will learn from their experiences about the topic of hearing. We hope you enjoy the show.
Thank you so much for being here, Lee. We're so excited to talk to you on the podcast today. I have Naveen here with us, who's going to get us started.
Hi, Lee. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. We just wanted to know a little bit about yourself and how you, how you relate to the deaf community.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Excited to help kick off the podcast here. Myself, I'm, been here in the Bay Area for about 3 years now, in California for about 4, but I'm originally, from the Midwest. I've been working in tech for quite a while, UX, front-end engineering type roles. Have a couple boys, my, oldest who's 5, youngest son, Eric, who's 4. And it's actually through Eric was my entry into the whole deaf world, deaf community, everything that's going on, because he was born on his newborn hearing screen. We actually got the I think it was the diagnosis there early on, or at least from that of didn't pass. And obviously, being my second child, they always present the newborn hearing screen, I think, as almost a formality, right? I know the nurses typically are like, "Oh yeah, we're doing this hearing screen thing," and just everybody passes, whatever. So, which again, I think statistically they're correct, but when it didn't, and then it's a matter of probably fluid in the ears, really wouldn't worry about it. But in fact, he ended up basically having a progressive hearing issue, and eventually by his about 13 months, we had another of a series of screens, and at that point he had no remaining hearing, so it was now profound. So that kind of kicked us into, I would say, like fully into I think really learning a lot about everything we needed to know. His initial, the initial screen was only in 1 year. Well, as it's told to you at the time, it was a mild to moderate hearing loss in 1 year, which at the time seems like a very innocuous sort of thing, right? Like if I have some mild knee soreness, right? No one's going to think that I can't, that it's going to have really much of an impact, on my day to day. But it is kind of funny. You later learn that mild to moderate hearing loss in 1 ear could mean that you're missing 50% of words in that ear. And then, with that later knowledge, it's like, well, that's not mild. That's not what I think of as mild. That's an interesting word. But so even from that point, you realize that your perspective is a little uneducated, right? But certainly when it certainly as it progressed too, and we had no remaining hearing then at that point, it was definitely then decisions about, what to do for him and what was going to be the best. And then there's obviously many, many choices you have to make. So and I think that was definitely our entry point into the deaf community. And then, we're here quite a few years later, and I think I still know 5% about what is to be known about this whole world and all the complexities in history and everything that's going on.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that detailed history. And it sounds like, you all were learning as you went along, from, the newborn hearing screen to, progressive hearing loss, to mild, moderate, to profound hearing loss. And so I'm so interested to hear about what resources or how you kept up with all these changing information that the doctors and medical staff were giving you.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think, in some ways, I think in California, and I mean, as I gather in quite a few states, I mean, there's at least a reasonable system set up, right? I mean, I think our first set of information was certainly from, obviously you get referred, coming out of the hospital with the non-passing hearing result. And so certainly into audiologists' offices, right? So that's, I think, your first interaction with this. And so I think our primary interaction was coming between them, and then with the fluid in the ear, it's kind of like bouncing back and forth between them and an ENT. That was almost like the first year was just this constant. Well, is it fluid, and what is it, and is it only in one ear, and so there's a lot of that. So I think like at that point, most of the interaction is there. Which again, there's these, the interesting terminology, I think, when I look back. I know in that first year, at least with the unilateral nature and mild to moderate, as I said, it made us think like, well, this is a little bit of a thing, but, I don't think he, didn't think it was going to really have much impact on the way he would operate at all. We were just going to generally operate as like, well, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for him to hear, but in general, not necessarily a big deal. Certainly the early start program was helpful as well, because I mean, you do get some assignment there. And I think they were, and that was in San Diego, it would have been in San Diego County and Orange County at the time, where we were in Eric's first year. But yeah, I mean, I think they did a good job of, at least giving you kind of the 101 when it starts. But I think, I think things ramped up a little bit once it was a profound loss, because then it's I think it becomes a more complex sort of thing, at least as we were uncovering it. And I think then the early start, then I think early start really remained our main touch point. I think early start really then transitioned to be our main touch point for where we were going to learn more about everything. And at the same time we got that diagnosis, we came up to, that's when we moved to the Bay Area, right? It was actually 4 weeks after he has ABR, where we found out it had progressed to a profound loss. So 4 weeks later, we move up to the Bay Area. Really seamless early start transition. But I think, in the first year up here, and as we went through the process of evaluating cochlear implants, and obviously then, the team at UCSF, well, actually, I think we were working with UCSF and Stanford initially, right? So there was obviously, both teams really well-versed in everything. So that was a lot of help. I think through early start, we started to learn about a lot of the other organizations in California, right? And like Hearing First, and like Lead K, trying to think off the top of my head. But yeah, I mean, some of those organizations started to come in to our world. So it's now more points of view, and I think then that's through some of those, that's when it started to broaden out too into, well, what's the role of signing? What's the role of, and actually then you start to learn, well, I mean, then you get into the complicated issues of ASL, and then you learn, and I think the county program here, actually I think is utilized, C for a while too. So then there was, okay, well, what's the difference between C and ASL? And then, and then everything that needs to go on with CIs that's not, not even close to just implant and you're done, right? The exact opposite of that. Another key resource too then was, something I think it's the Baker Foundation and Stanford puts on in the summer, the Listen to Me camp. So I think that one, Listen to Me, was like almost, just absolutely fantastic. That, I think basically that Listen to Me 1 week camp was a real turning point in our understanding of all the complexity that was going to be going on, because then you get into learning about how IEPs are supposed to work and what that is. And it's just, but I'll say like that, I couldn't recommend like that the Listen to Me week enough. And I think anyone we've met through that camp, speaks the same. That's such a crucial, just 1 week of learning so much from the other parents, and they bring in so many interdisciplinary people in that 1 week. It's so jam packed that that's a really great resource. And then from there, I mean, I think you're somewhat getting into a world of, now you can start to read all the various journal articles that are supporting or refuting all of these different ways of doing things, and you start to get into different, books and perspectives. And yeah, I mean, I think that's as far as I can remember the resources that have been helpful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing about the different resources that, were helpful to you and your family. I was just more curious about if you could take me back to where you were thinking through the option Eric had moving forward in terms of his hearing health and his hearing care.
Yeah, I mean, are you referring to kind of the decision to go with implantation in the first place, or the decisions maybe past there?
I guess you could go through sorry, could you repeat what you asked me again?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, are you saying like the decisions to make once we decided to go with, cochlear?
Yeah, the decisions that you wanted to go with, getting CIs.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean,
or how did you come about to, that decision that you wanted, or you learned about CIs and you were thinking about getting it?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think the progressive nature of what happened with Eric made it a little bit different, because it was an oddly quick decision in some ways. Because if I think of the actual timeline, it was actually New Year's Eve was his ABR, and then doctors tell us, I think, or the audiologist, tells us, that no, he's now profoundly deaf. And like, okay, I mean, I think. And I know the audiologist there very clearly tells you, I mean, and I think she just laid it out very matter of fact. She's like, well, people have obviously generally two options that they can choose. They can choose to go, fully sign, and not get cochlear implants. And then they can choose to, get cochlear implants and go down that route. Then, cited the, 95% or so odd of deaf children are born to hearing, families. And she was just like, so, most people go with a CI, right? I don't think she was necessarily that wasn't like an endorsement from her perspective, but I think it was just saying like, this is what I see most people do, I think, I mean, my wife and I went out to dinner on New Year's Eve, then our privately planned New Year's Eve dinner, and had really only one thing to talk about, obviously. But I almost think that we almost had already made the decision that night. But I say like the progressive nature kind of made it differently, because it wasn't as if, I think if we had found out that he was, he was profoundly deaf, say 4 weeks at, like say, the newborn hearing screen was like, a fail in both ears, and then, all that. I don't think that there's any way that decision would have happened as quickly. I think it was because we were kind of having to think about all of this type of stuff for the prior 13 months already, at least to some degree. So in some ways, we'd probably already done some of our thought process. What confirmed the decision, I think, was, the other, as we start to work with then a CI team, and initially this is, Kaiser's team, I think in Southern California. But, they really quickly lay out the info and have the journal backing, the articles to show you, there's the receipts. Like here is the number one factor in CI success is age of implantation, right? Mm-hmm. Like everything else, in the number two, family support, right? Like how, but between those two, then everything else is such a long tail. Everything else almost doesn't matter, like brand that you pick and all this other stuff, right? And it's like, okay, so, when we're thinking this through, I think I think we made the decision quick, but it was like a really, really tough decision, because we're deciding something for Eric that he frankly may disagree with later in life. We have no idea, right? But I think the thing that made the decision compelling of like, well, then I think we should make the decision to implant is that if age of implantation is the number one factor for success as far as being able to, hear with as high fidelity and do that, then that's a decision that we can only make right now. Like I can't put that decision in his hands when he's 18. Like it's not the same thing. I'm not putting the same decision in there. Right. So there's a time window right now to make that decision, right? So I can make this decision now, and I can also still support Eric if if just to take the radical opposite thing, right, is if he chose at 18 that he's like, you know what, I actually don't want to I don't want to wear CIs anymore. I want to fully sign, and that would be totally fine. It seemed like nothing's perfect, but it was as close as we could offer to give him as much optionality for his later life as possible, right? And yeah, I think that kind of solidified that, like, well, that's the decision we have to make right now as parents, because that's kind of the job as a parent, not just for hearing, for everything. You're making all kinds of decisions for them that they may or may not agree with later on, but you're just making the best decision at the time. And I think it was through that same process, that we came to the conclusion on CIs.
Yeah, I think my mom, potentially she did make the same decision for me, when I was born. She found out around 2 years old that I was, profoundly deaf. So she decided to go on with the surgery. And, I got my implants at 4 years old, because back in 96, they weren't doing it at a younger age. So, I got my implant. And then my mom, she knew around that time that she would have to work really hard, and keep it really consistent with my work, and then, to make me successful. And then, like you said, it's the age of implantation, and also, from there on, it's, and family support. So, I had a whole lot of family support, and that's what, made me, successful today, I guess. But, even if with implant or without implants, you can still be successful. So, for Eric's decision at 18, if he doesn't want implants, I'm sure he will still be successful, in terms of what he would be doing, with his life. Yeah. And I also wanted to ask you another question was, Katrine, do you want to take over?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing that detailed, thought process that you and your partner went through. It sounds like having that time to really wrap your head around what it is that's all going on for those 13 months helped you make that timely decision when you needed to at the time that you did. And so I really appreciate you letting us know about that. I am wondering how Eric is doing now, if you have decided to keep ASL as part of his life and your life, and if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I have continued. I've continued to take ASL courses. I started ASL courses about the time. I think it'd be around the time of his implantation. Overall, so I've continued that, and I would say, I'm still quite the beginner in it, right?
Yeah.
And I think consequently, I wouldn't say. I think our goal. The one thing that I do realize in all this, it is a lot of. There is again, that's the second biggest factor in the CI success is the amount of work that you put into it as a family, right? It's certainly more work to teach Eric, spoken language than it is for his older brother, who's typically hearing. So it does take a lot of time. So the burden of time is pretty tough. So I think that ultimately we haven't been able to dedicate as much time to, exposing him to ASL. So I think where he's at, because of all this, I think his receptive ASL is reasonable, right? Which is to the extent of all the times, certainly all the times that, say bath time and nap time and all these sort of obvious scenarios. I think I can communicate to him, and he understands very well what I'm signing to him and wanting and everything. But he'll respond back to me even with, his implants off, speaking. So I think it's more receptive, but, I think I'm also relatively okay with that, because the other thing that we had read early on too was just that in language development in general, it's about keeping the door open more, right? That any language you're exposed to in your early years, you have easier attainment for full mastery later on, right? Because you just have this pruning process at, something between 2 and 4, where if you weren't exposed to it, whether it's a manual language or whether it's a spoken language.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of it was just like, well, if we're at least keeping the door open by giving his brain more exposure to sign, again, it's that optionality later on. So it'll make his ability to, fully master ASL, should he choose to really want to dive deep, it'll make it easier, right? So I think we're somewhat accomplishing it very imperfectly that goal. At least I hope we are. But on his language development, he's doing what we need, to go on right now. Like he was implanted at 21 months, so I think he's what does it say? He's on track with his hearing age, right? So his speech and language is appropriate for for how many months he's had hearing. And he's, in the last maybe 6 to 8 months, he's starting to like pull away from that, right? And pull ahead of that, which, should mean that he's able to like kind of catch up to his like typically hearing peers, right? I mean, I think luckily for Eric, his the implantation went, I think on the bell curve distribution, like he's sitting on like the 90th percentile as far as access and everything. So he was very fortunate in that regard that, he's hearing about as well as you could possibly expect a CI to go. I mean, like one of the anecdotal things is, I can absolutely talk to Eric from the upstairs and he's like a room away downstairs, right? Which is everything we were told initially, like, we'll try to keep all of your speech within 3 feet of a CI recipient, like for the best, and everything. But it's like, his range is pretty far. So, I think that's helped him out in that regard. So, so I see him having some ability, then some access to ASL then as well. But it's certainly not a perfect 50-50 bimodal, bilingual picture by any means. But,
No, I definitely can relate to that, and it sounds like you are all doing your best to give him as many things in front of him as options so that later on he really can make the best decision for himself. I grew up learning Arabic as my first language, and when we moved to the States, I picked up English, but then my parents really wanted me to learn English. So then I became English dominant. And then later on, I wanted to maintain my Arabic. So I quickly picked it back up, both writing and reading and speaking. And so I definitely understand what you're saying by keeping his brain very plastic to ASL and spoken language.
Yeah, that's the hope. I love any, even, I know it's anecdotes, but I love hearing any anecdotal like examples of that too. Cause that's the hope going forward, that it makes it easier. I know we had heard of, like certainly numerous examples of CI. We had heard of, different, like from different families that we talked to, in their children didn't receive CIs, that they did learn, ASL pretty successfully later on. So that gave us some more evidence that like, well, that's totally possible. So we can give him the most options, even if we do things in this order. Right. But yeah, also I will say, at least in our experience, a little struggle has been that it's not, I think any sort of fully bilingual bimodal path that you pursue as a parent isn't necessarily, there's not like a really well laid out path for you on that, right? And it's probably just also, I don't know how many people are truly pursuing that aggressively. I'm just not sure, but And I could be wrong too. I've said at the beginning, I know about 5% at best of everything there is to know right now, probably. Yeah. But I do feel like there's, back to that, the audiologist initially, she's saying, hey, you can go sign or you can go CI. And I think in general, I think there's a pretty good support mechanism towards going completely one way or the other, right? And also just capacity issues too. I just wonder, it'd probably be very hard to construct a program that like completely tried to cover off and be 50-50, like bimodal, bilingual. So it may just be a matter of scale, right? It's just really tough. It would be tough to do that in the first place. But as it stands out, like if you're going to try to do both, or try to expose your kids to both ways, it seems like you're going to kind of have to freelance or cobble together the way you do it anyways. So, which is fine. But yeah, it's, yeah, I mean, it's again, it's learning as you go along. That's kind of what it is.
Yeah, I feel like what potentially, made my mom decide to give me implants with that. Not everybody in my family will be able to do ASL, because I live with my grandparents as well. So, with my grandparents, they also speak a different language. They don't speak English because, they came from India. So my mom was told, from the audiologist that I should be able to, stick with one language throughout when I was growing up. So, yeah, so it was more English dominant in my family. But then until later on, where I was able to, speak and do it proficiently, my mom had, put me into my language school, where I learned how to speak and write, and my mom, they learned ASL in the very beginning to communicate with me when I didn't have my implants, after like 2 years old, 4. So I learned ASL for those 2 years. But, I unfortunately, I don't know it anymore, and I would love to learn it again. But I do read lips. So when I don't have my implants on, I still, communicate with my parents or my brother, by reading their lips and then, saying back to them what they had asked me. But yeah, I feel like it's very interesting, whichever path you take, like CI or, no CI, I'm glad that we still are able to communicate with each other, which is the most important thing. Yeah, so, moving on, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the hopes that you have for the future and with regards to the hearing health and hearing differences in the community? Now, your child getting cochlear implants or hearing from different families, for me, I also do have a lot of hopes for the future, such as, improving CI, such as making it more, compatible for me because I have a Freedom and a Nucleus 24. My internal devices are different. So I want to see those in the future, the compatibility with those two, so yeah, I just wanted to see what are your thoughts for the future.
Actually, yeah, no, that's actually a really good point. Like, yeah, I mean, having worked in technology, I hadn't actually thought about that one, but that actually makes a lot of sense because a lot of, I would guess, yeah, a lot of people of your age would have been like implanted in 1 year and then later on. Yeah. So yeah, which again, like, I mean, in a lot of the technology I've worked in, like, yeah, standardization, there's always a cycle of like things are proprietary and then things, like need standardization, and it's a messy process, but they eventually get there. Yeah. And I would see, that's actually a great point. I'll sign on to that. Like, please. Yeah. We should be able to have some type of interoperability, standards, get us out. I mean, we'd be standardizing across 3 companies. So it seems like the scale should be doable. I mean, I think some of the things that stick out to me as possibilities, and I know I've talked to some, certainly from listening to me, there's some, audiology researchers. I know I've had some chats around, some of this, and even with some of the company reps. It's, I mean, certainly, I guess like from my, armchair understanding of how all this works, right, is, we definitely have limitations in what we can do as far as the number of channels. I think that was one of my early naive, thoughts was like, why only 16 channels? Like, why don't we just bump 200? Like, let's put 1,000 channels in this, right? Like, and then very quickly was reminded of, basic, basic electronics and Ohm's law, and then the idea that you're electrically stimulating within fluids. So now you're going to have crosstalk. And I was like, okay, got it. So you have to deal with certainly, more channels. That doesn't make sense. But, we definitely know that we're learning a whole lot of what we can do and what we can modify and understand with, different AI and ML models as applied to audio, right? So one thing that seems that that I'm hopeful that there's a lot of potential for, for growth. I mean, this would be more in the short to medium term is, again, you wouldn't have to change the underlying hardware, but if you could maybe upgrade, some of our, speech and language algorithms that are running, to process the audio input. And if we could take that another step, with everything we're learning there. Again, I think we were talking about before we were recording, just like to the level of what we're doing with live captioning with, with AI, right? I know, I mean, it's another step up, for the live audio processing, but I know that there's been some interesting work that's being done there with some potential different models. And I know I think maybe AB's considering some of them. I know they were recently even doing a hackathon, and I think a couple of the leading, I thought a couple of the leading winners were around basically potentially improved algorithms that they may be looking to put into future products. I mean, you go a step further than obviously now you get into the really, interesting stuff like, obviously Neuralink is probably the most popularized version of this, right? But I know that there's obviously been inquiries, to, maybe potentially stimulating the auditory nerve directly. And again, like ways of, is there a even higher fidelity way to tap directly into the nerve input, right? Obviously the complexity of that is way different than stimulating the cochlea. But it's like, again, it's that underlying technology on the CIs, while amazing, is a few decades old, which in some ways is actually very comforting. I like the fact that this is very well established technology, since it's like permanently in ERIC, right? Yes. Like that's actually one way where cutting edge technology would actually potentially be a detriment right now. So actually give me the stable stuff where, it has its limitations, but we definitely know we have a lot of the bugs worked out, right? Which is good. But yeah, as we go forward, like that's obviously an area that we're, beyond just hearing, that we're investigating, is that, brain machine interaction, and what we can do there obviously, could help a lot, for the CI recipients in the future, or new CI recipients, or whatever we come up with there. So very interested in what we could discover there in the next couple decades.
Yeah, and we're so lucky to be talking with you, an engineer who has probably, numerous amazing ideas to branch out and make new discoveries. Something more analog that I thought about too was, incorporating ASL as an immersion school. Like we have all these other schools that have all these immersion programs for other languages. Why not for ASL? As we progressively age, we also, incur some hearing loss. And so maybe ASL is going to be the mode of communication later on. None of us, can predict that now, but some food for thought.
I think that's a fantastic idea. And you're right. Like, I guess we're not at that age. Well, the kiddos the oldest is just in kindergarten, but you're right. Like, I know, I think even in the district we're in, there's just off the top of my head, I've heard about, there's a Mandarin immersion school, obviously Spanish immersion schools. But I think that's a great idea. I think that would be more like maybe, like also breaking down any sort of like silos on learning or anything like that. I think that'd be fantastic to be able to offer that. I know just anecdotally, anyone, like colleagues, friends, acquaintances, anybody that like ASL has come up with, I think they've instantly had kind of aha moments of, even just as a second language, what an amazingly like useful language, and just even circumstances in daily life, it could be useful to know ASL, right? Because there's actually, even if if you just want to go to just basic utility, there's also numerous circumstances that even if you have typical hearing and you're not, you haven't experienced anything there, like there's obviously still circumstances where it's actually, you can't hear very well. It is very loud. There's actually just very practical reasons to have this in your tool belt. And obviously its power expands the more people know ASL, right? ASL is more and more useful the more people know, right? So I think it'd be fantastically useful. I think it'd be a great way to use some of the budget that we have. And anything, ASL is the only second language that I've learned. And I think that if you just zoom out in general, so few people learn a second language in the US in general. So anything that's going to expand people's, I'm really actually grateful that that's been something that's come into my life, where it's forced the issue of like, oh, well, actually I should, because it'd be difficult to learn a second language. that's probably why I hadn't done it before. It's probably why a lot of people don't do it. So it's a great reason to do it. And the more that we can encourage that in general, it'd be fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We really appreciate it. We had such a great conversation with you today, and we really appreciate you being on the podcast. But before we end today, I just wanted to ask you what advice you would give to someone who is at the point where they're making a decision to get a CI or, or even a parent having to make that decision for their kid. We just wanted to know what you have, what advice you would like to give to them.
Yeah, I think try to reach out and get as many different perspectives as you can, get your hands on. I think you very quickly have to learn, like, there are lots of different options and there are lots of kind of like follow-on decisions that are going to go on with whatever you choose. I think one of you said it really well, though, like earlier, earlier in our talk. I think the focus is whatever you're doing, like, your focus has to be, you have to find out a way, you have to pick the path that's you're going to expose your child to language as soon as possible, because that's the true clock that's ticking, right? So whether you go with CIs, whether you go with CIs and no ASL, whether you go fully ASL, whether you do a mix of both, whatever you do and whatever combinations, realize that that's your main goal, right? Is how am I going to expose my child to language as quickly as possible? And then, certainly talk to, work through your contacts. I found them through, Early Start and Listen to Me, and, but like whatever your local, people that you're talking to, just try to get referrals to parents, who will give you their perspective, right? Obviously talk to as many experts you can, as far as audiologists, but even, contact the, local school of the deaf. And basically any and all perspectives that you can get as quickly as possible, you can only help, because whatever you choose, you're choosing, even if you go CI, hopefully what you'll learn very quickly is you didn't pick something that just, quote unquote, fixed anything. There was no fixing to be going on, and also fixing would be a really bad idea. That's something you need to learn very quickly. That's not that's only like the first step, right? Even in, if you choose 100% sign, obviously that's your first step too. There's a lot of work that you're going to be doing behind either of those, and that's where the real work is. But that's going to be like a marathon, so you should be getting as much information as possible to understand which marathon you're picking, right? And then you have to figure out what's, think through what's good for your family, and then ultimately, as you talk to a lot of people, there's going to be a lot of strong opinions in this world. I think that was one thing I didn't know. I think we definitely didn't know. There are a lot of strong opinions in this world, and there's a lot of really good reasons and understandable reasons for all of that. And hopefully, as you learn more about the history and everything, and again, I think I'm only scratching the surface there. It's a really big, whatever you're picking there, there's going to be a lot to learn, and there's going to be some strong opinions. But whatever you do, it's just like in everything in parenting, I guess. Like you're going to ultimately just have to pick what's going to be best for you and your family. Go forward with it. Do the best that you can, and if there's some opinions you disagree with, be respectful, but understand that no one decision is correct or incorrect. It's just whatever's going to work for you.
We could not have asked for a better way to end our session today with you. And we agree with everything you said. And that's what we're hopefully trying to put out there, is that children are so resilient, and no matter what path you choose for them, as long as they are in a supportive environment, that's all they know. That's, quote unquote, what they've grown into. And so we are so excited that you share the same sentiment, and that Eric is in such an amazing home, and we're only so excited to hear about all the amazing things he continues to accomplish. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions or would like to suggest a topic for us to cover on a future episode, please send us an email at silencepodcast21@gmail.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us for our next episode.